children who would be potentially removed against their will. Creates an issue even if they attempt to homeschool, if they have parents who both have to work, and many of you are probably in that situation, or where there's a single parent family and obviously that parent has to work, so how would they homeschool a child if they are not enrolled? So for me, that's been the crux of the issue, not so much the issue about the pros and cons of the science of vaccines. There's a whole nother argument in terms of religious rights, and as a non-lawyer, I'm not going to discuss nor debate the legal constitutional issues with you because that's really not my strength, so I'll defer to the attorneys on that issue. There is the issue of parental control. Should parents have the ability to control what goes into their children or not? Does the public welfare outweigh that right for parents, which is a difficult decision? How many will it affect? There was a lot of confusion apparently at the Appropriations Committee last week with numbers. We spoke with the Department of Public Health over the weekend, and for the 2019-20 school year, K through 6 is 4,984 religious exemptions on file, and 7 through 12 is 2,661, for a total of 7,645 religious exemptions per the Department of Public Health as of, I think we received this Friday afternoon. So total of 76445. I'm going to have this discussion with my colleague and chair of the Public Health Committee, Representative Steinberg. I'm going to go over many of these issues with him on the floor of the House. And where I'm going to start is the issue of urgency. We're just coming off the pandemic with all that has entailed in terms of impact upon us as a society, in terms of economics, in terms of jobs, in terms of its impact upon children and schooling at all levels, preschool through college. And I think right before we had the public hearing on this bill, the Department of Public Health released their data for 2019-20, which showed data concerning MMR, mumps, measles, rubella, measles being one of the most infectious conditions where you need a high community or herd immunity to make things safe for society. We are about, and you can check the numbers, but I believe about 96.2% in kindergarten and 98% for 7th grade, thus above the required 95th percentile. I think we were about 5th nationwide in terms of total vaccination rate. So that speaks volumes to the work that we do here in the state and our level of protection. But perhaps it allows us the time to pause and perhaps focus on education, because a big issue in the schools remains perhaps what the DPH would call noncompliance. Children who just are not vaccinated. They don't have a medical exemption, they don't have a religious exemption, they're just not vaccinated. So I think we have the time to focus on education, to try to get as many more children vaccinated as possible without removing them from school. One of our best people testifying, a professor with expertise in vaccines and immunology, felt that this was not an emergent or urgent situation, but he was concerned about the increase in religious exemptions, which over 7 years had gone from 1.4 to 2.3%, though it declined slightly from 2.5 to 2.3 over the past year. So I think there's time to educate. I think there's time to take a close look at the impact upon children educationally, how we would implement this. What would enforcement be? You know, if a school has a number of non-compliant kids, are they forced out? Are they disenrolled? Are they expelled? If they're enrolled, then do they have to go through an expulsion process, or are they just quote-unquote disenrolled? And I'm not an expert on the terminology in terms of getting into and out of the school system. But I think those are questions we haven't answered, and I think we need far more input from the State Department of Education, Department of Public Health, before doing this. So I think there's still many questions. I think there's some good parts to this bill. I think trying to improve or extend the medical exemptions, I think, makes sense. It's hard to fit exemptions in a tight box. The CDC has very tough criteria for allowing medical exemptions, and I think giving individual practitioners and patients a little more leeway, I think, makes sense. So I won't go on any further because I'm going to be going through most of this with Chairman Steinberg as we go through the bill, and I think there's going to be long debate, and I think with that I'll turn it over to our House Leader, Representative Candelora.
Thank you, Representative Pettit. And I think to just, put an exclamation point on this issue, one of the things this bill certainly does not address is the fact that the state of Connecticut offers a constitutional right to an education in the state of Connecticut. And we have seen the impacts of COVID over the past year on our children, how isolation and distance learning has impacted them. We are going through the process of trying to enhance education over the next 2 years with the federal money. And we are today potentially taking a vote to deprive a group of individuals access to that education. To us, that's not acceptable. It's something that the legislature should be addressing. And I anticipate that this bill certainly doesn't address it, but the courts will. The last piece of this is that we don't know the number of children that are impacted. We often hear that there's roughly 7,600 children that are exercising a religious exemption. That accounts roughly, 1.8% or 2% of the overall population, yet somehow the vaccination numbers are much lower. Well, the fact is that we have a number of children that are just non-compliant. They have not handed in paperwork, so we don't know whether or not they're vaccinated. If this is such an important public policy, the Department of Education and Public Health should be doing a better job of enforcing the laws that are already on the books. We have ascertained it could be upward of 20,000 children that are non-compliant. And so this bill, the scope, could be impacting upward of 30,000 kids in our educational system. So before these type of leaps were taken, we would have hoped that both the Department of Public Health and SDE would have looked at those issues, talked to the schools, and figure out how we bring everybody into compliance, whether it be through the exercise of a medical exemption, a religious exemption, or just handing in your paperwork. And those questions still haven't been answered. And so with that, I would be happy to take any questions. Well, I think, yeah, I mean, there are individuals that don't want this bill passed at all. And obviously, there is discussion over how to address the issue of people that are not vaccinated in our school systems. But ultimately, what we heard from so many of those people are how the medical system is failing them, how they want to get a medical exemption. They think they're entitled to a medical exemption, but they can't get one. And in fact, at the federal level, the CDC guidelines are so restrictive that your baby needs to present an anaphylactic shock before you're entitled to a medical exemption. I'm very sympathetic to those families that might have had child number 1 have some sort of an impact to a vaccine, and yet child number 2 cannot get a medical exemption because they need to demonstrate some type of an allergic reaction before they can get it. Those are the failings, I think, at our federal level of those guidelines that are impacting these families. And what I will say is the bill does attempt to address that issue by looking at the contraindications of family members. And that's where I think we need to start moving as a state first to try to draw together the individuals who do not want to get vaccines and our medical community. And right now there's a huge wall dividing the two. So I think fundamentally there are people in our caucus that are concerned that if this bill passes as is, children will be thrown out of school next year. And so certainly there are individuals in our caucus who want to protect those children from being thrown out. But it doesn't fundamentally address the questions of what we do going forward as a state and how the children who are unable to have a public education, how that education is provided to them. The bill is totally silent on that issue. No. And that's a good question as well. The bill does not have enforcement procedures. Given the fact that there's a constitutional right to an education, we've not heard from our superintendents. I would argue that you cannot deny somebody without due process. So I'm not sure that this bill would result in children being thrown out. But the public policy being set today by this bill does imply that, and we're concerned. We don't have that number, but you could sort of extrapolate it when you go through the data of the people that are deemed non-compliant. The Department of Public Health has conveniently never put that information on their website, even though they readily have it. And I think it's important, if we are going to have an open and honest debate, they should have disclosed that information to the legislature. I think when I met with them a year ago on this issue and we discussed it, they have that information. They chose not to put it on their website. I asked for the policy reason on why that wasn't put there, and I did not have an answer. Well, I think that that will be tested by the courts. I would tend to disagree. If we are going to unenroll children, which I think that that is the way the bill is written, we would need due process associated with that. I think no question it will be challenged in the courts. Well, it's interesting because in the public hearings, we didn't hear from parents that presented that type of an issue to us. What we heard time and again is parents telling us that my child has had allergic reactions, or my child, I had another sibling that was injured and I could not get a medical exemption. So there are families that believe in vaccines but cannot get a medical exemption, and so they are pushed into the religious education category. That was more of what I have heard from individuals. And the reality is most of our districts are all in compliance right now. So by and large, we are above herd immunity in most of our schools. Yeah, I mean, that has been one of the suggestions that members of my caucus have made to the other side of the aisle. And for whatever reason, this bill has been around for 4 years. Despite our attempts to try to negotiate the bill, the majority, the Democrats, have decided to take a sledgehammer to this issue as opposed to something more gentle.
Senator, you said the bill had no enforcement procedures. Is there any language in the bill that gives those enforcement procedures to the State Department of Education? Or what will happen, in other words, if you guys don't necessarily, correct me if I'm wrong, have to legislate every single thing. If the State Department of Education enforces it, then we do have enforcement.
I think it's left up to each district to decide how they're going to enforce it.
And that is left up by silence in the bill or by assumption or?
I think by silence in the bill. Practically speaking, children enroll in school and then their paperwork is submitted. Kindergarten classes, they begin enrollment in the early summertime. In June, the advertising starts going out. So logistically, I don't know how this process is going to work for our districts.
So theoretically, we could have 169 different thoughts about this? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, we currently have that, and I guess that's the big question. We currently have a number of children who are non-compliant in our school districts. Despite the law saying you need to be vaccinated or you need to have a religious exemption or medical exemption in order to be enrolled in school. And currently we have a number of children that have none of those things. So the law is currently not being enforced to begin with. This bill does nothing to address that issue. Yeah, I think that I have no reason to believe that this bill doesn't have the support. It's been proposed for a number of years. If the amendment is called, I think it would get some Republican support because people are concerned. Otherwise, children would be thrown out of school next year. I think that is an overriding concern for every individual. Politics and policy aside, we don't believe any child should be denied the right to an education. So certainly there may be support to minimize the damage that is being done to our students.
One thing on these different numbers, 30,000 a year, et cetera. Representative Steinberg said today it could be as low as 1,000. The question was, how many people will be impacted? He said possibly as low as 1,000, and there's no way it will be the 8,500 or 8,300 that he talked about. So take us through those numbers a little more.
Yeah, so I mean, hypothetically, right now we know the universe of children that are in school that are exercising religious exemption. And from K through 12, that number is around 7,600. If this bill passed with the amendment bringing it down to kindergarten, the individuals that would be impacted are those that are newly trying to enroll into school. That number hovers around, say, 800 students per year. So what this bill, the impact of this bill going forward, would essentially be disenfranchising about 800 students every year and denying those 800 children a right to an education in the state of Connecticut. Well, I mean, there's certainly going to be two approaches. I think we're going to have, sort of a civil disobedience where people are going to try to enroll their children into schools, and I am very sympathetic with that approach. I think the other approach is to be talking with your doctors. Today, this bill is setting a policy that the medical profession is failing some of these children, and they're seeking to amend the statutes to provide a more robust medical exemption. And I would say for those parents with these concerns, to seek out those exemptions for the medical and try to obtain that exemption in order to enroll your children. Yeah, I don't know when that will happen. I would hope that they realize the gravity of this situation and will respond quickly. Although based on their responsiveness to this underlying bill and how they treated the Republican caucus, I'm concerned that they might not be so quick at putting these forms forward.
The bill specifies that the certificate has to be on the website as 10/1/21.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, we know of two religions, Christian Scientists and Dutch Reformists, who do not believe in vaccines, and so there is an element of religious belief. There are also individuals in less organized religions that believe that they have a religious right to not claim an exemption. It is not the role of government to question the sincerity of one's religious beliefs. And so I think it's a valid issue, whether it affects 10 people or 1,000 people. I think there's a valid point to that. unquestionably, the state of Connecticut is removing a religious right. And unlike California that did not have a religious exemption, this is a very different approach today than a state like California. Yeah, I think most of my caucus, and I think most of them have been vaccinated. It's not a matter of questioning the science. This is a matter of parental choice and the autonomy of making those decisions, balanced against the public health needs, which we feel have not been demonstrated throughout this whole process because the vaccination rates are so high in the state of Connecticut. Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll leave it at this. I'm sensitive to that question for two reasons. One, it is their personal, health decisions that I don't think it's in my place to ask them. I will say I don't know of any caucus member who is not getting vaccinated, and I'm cautious about that question as well. I think that we are getting close to politicizing something that should not be politicized. It's not a matter of Republicans 80% are getting vaccinated versus 90% of Democrats. I don't think that's a good position or a good message for our press to begin sending out to people. It's certainly not a political issue, and I'll say in talking with individuals within the caucus on both sides of the aisle, it's just a very personal decision on whether or not people are getting vaccinated.
Just to clarify what numbers you had, very right. Over the weekend you said 7,600 around religious exemptions, is that what you said over the weekend?
Right.
And how many, I'm not clear, how many medical exemptions are there? We haven't really discussed that.
Yeah, the medical is lower. I think it's around 0.7%. I want to say it's somewhere around 1,800.
1,800 medical exemptions from
K to 12.
Okay, thank you.
I don't. I know they do have to file a form, but I don't have that number. Stumped me. I know. All right, thank you all.